Imagine going on your dream vacation. You're going to a tropical resort, but instead on your way there, the plane crashes, and instead you end up on a deserted island. And on that deserted island, you must try to survive and get off of the island. And if you don't, you'll be left stranded. Next slide. So the goal of Stranded is to survive, and you do this by collecting resources. And the resources are food and water. Another resource is wood, which you use to build your raft, and in return, you get to get off of the island and win. Next slide. So to set up the board, you have 35 tile pieces that you will randomly shuffle, and you will randomly place them on the board. And to do this, it creates a dynamic environment for each time you play, which leads to more interesting gameplay, so players don't get bored playing it over and over again. And then you place the resources around the board for the players to collect. And then you place the monkey in the middle, and then the tigers on the corners that we're going to be talking about later. Next slide. So you track your progress with your resources that you collect with a scorecard. And at the beginning of the game, you start off with 4 food and 4 water. And you start off with 0 wood chips. And you start off with these to give players sort of a beginning so they can survive and move around and collect the stuff that they need to in order to keep on surviving for more turns to come. Next slide. And we have random events that players can use. This involves giving players more freedom for strategy and gives them more interesting choices on when to play these cards. And each player gets 4 cards, and it's all random. And there are things that can either help you or things that can harm players. For example, one that says you can move the tiger to any space and attack an opponent. This can harm other players by attacking them and making them lose things. Or there's some other ones that allow you to carry, for example, like more wood. Next slide. So in order to navigate the board, you have to roll a 6-sided die. And if you roll a 1 through 3, you will only expend 1 food and water. But if you roll a 4 through 6, you lose 2 food and water. So you have to decide whether going further is worth losing more resources, or if you only want to move a little bit and expend just 1. Next slide. So how do the animals on the board move? Well, they move with a 4-sided die. And the monkey can steal wood resources. And the wood resources will be given to the player that moved the monkey onto the player that was carrying the wood. The tiger is very similar to the monkey, but instead of the player getting it, it just drops the pieces on the board for anybody to take. And what's important about the animal pieces is that they can move throughout the board wherever. They can move on the tiles that the people can't move on. Next slide.
So some of our game developments and changes. When we first started coming up with an idea for a board game, we thought we wanted to do one for a survival game. And we also thought that it'd be fun to have a game where the board was different every time we played. We did this through the movement tiles that you saw earlier, and placing them randomly every time. In playtesting, we saw that the paper pieces would usually get kind of moved around and wouldn't look very nice. So we decided to make a game board out of cardboard that kind of had the setup on it and made it look a little better. And then once we had the general idea down, we had to try and make it more interesting. So one of our first ideas was to try to implement a rule that would allow players to directly steal from each other, but with some sort of risk. We put this into the rules, and it didn't really get used very much because it was too much of a risk. And then another thing we did was had to figure out a way for people to win and use these resources. So we thought it might be fun to have the players have to worry about food and water and wood to make it interesting. We had to decide how many of each resource the players would start with so they wouldn't run out too soon, but also wouldn't have too many. This was kind of difficult because we just had to have it be played for it to work. And then we ended up deciding on 4 water and 4 food to start out with, because this would let you move around the board some, but not go too far. So you had to start collecting. And then we had to decide how many resources players would have to use when they decided to move. We originally said that whenever you move, you would have to use 1 water and 1 food resource. And through the game testing, we decided that this we decided to change this a little and make it more dependent on how far you move. So, like Brent said, if you move further, you'll have to expend more food and water, but you get to move further. And then we decided that to win, you have to collect 7 pieces of wood. Oops. So some of the other additions to the game, the first one was adding the resource scorecard. We added this to just help players keep track of their resources and help make the game more organized. Some of the other additions to the game, once we got started, were the event cards. With the original game, there weren't really many player interactions and not a lot of interesting choices. And we decided that making 16 event cards, 4 for each player, would really help with this. Each player would get 4 cards, as we said, for the whole game. And then we originally had some that were, for example, lose 2 food for the player who had it, and we decided this really wasn't that interesting, so we changed some around to try and make them more fun. And then after this, we decided that we still needed more player interaction, so we added tigers. The 2 tigers would be moved around the board and let players attack each other. And then, still through more testing, we wanted to add another piece that players could move, and this was the monkey. So players could now attack each other and steal from each other all at the same time. And then with the rule set changes, we mainly added the component list and a lot more pictures throughout. This really helped make the game rules more interesting, they look better, and then much easier to understand. With the rules having more pictures, you could show players what each piece was and then explain what it did and how to move it. And since the start, Stranded has been a survival game, but we've made a lot of changes to the board, the rules, and the gameplay itself. We've added and taken away things, and overall, I think the changes we made were good to make the game hopefully more fun to play. And they also help lead to interesting choices and strategies. And we got some of the inspiration for the game board from Survive, Escape from Atlantis. And this is the rules.
Okay.